Hey everyone, this is Mason with Herb Rally. We're here for another episode of the Herbalist Hour, and today I'm joined by Jared Tarr, and he is the intern and volunteer coordinator for an awesome local Eugene nonprofit called Friends of Buford Park. So welcome, Jared.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. Great to be talking to all of you.
Before the show, we were just going all over all of our different talking points, and every single one I'm like, oh my gosh, the herbal community is going to love this. So strap in, and yeah, it's going to be a great episode. But I would like to know a little bit more about your background. How did you get into this work? How did you end up working at Friends of Buford Park? And yeah, just kind of take us along that journey.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up on the southern Oregon coast, grew up kind of in a conservation family, so started paying attention to nature at a really young age. And that eventually led me to Olympia, Washington, where I went to the Evergreen State College, and I was positive that I wanted to be a research ecologist. I learned pretty quickly that that's really lonely work, and I like working with people. So over time, through a lot of relationships with other nonprofits, I worked with the Nature Conservancy, People for Puget Sound, a handful of other folks. I ended up moving to Eugene, and I had been working in the kind of prairies and oak savanna ecosystems that we have here in Buford Park. And when I saw this position open up, it was kind of perfect. I get to work with wonderful community of volunteers and guest land stewards here who really have the health and vibrancy of these ecosystems at the core of what they do. And that's hugely rewarding.
Yeah, I consider Olympia as like one of the herbal meccas. I like Eugene, Asheville, North Carolina, Olympia for sure. So yeah, lots of herbalism going on over there.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about your program that you took at Evergreen? Is it my understanding that you get to kind of choose your major at Evergreen or kind of create your own adventure type of thing?
Sure, yeah. I think Evergreen has changed a lot since I was there, so I won't try to speak too authoritatively.
Sure.
But it's a liberal arts school, and one in which you don't really have a major. You have areas of focus, and you don't really have grades. You have qualitative evaluations. Yeah. So instead of a letter, you get a paragraph. And that was really attractive to me because quantifying everything that we do in life, I think, is pretty soul-sucking. Yeah. I ended up taking courses in microbial ecology and learning about mycology work and like industrial composting, taking botany courses and field ecology courses in forestry, and then a lot of environmental education. I don't think any Evergreen education would be complete without some political economy, and took a great class. I was just looking at sci-fi authors and writing and looking at it through like a radical political lens. And
that's so cool.
Yeah.
And you were saying pre-show that you were roommates with Peter McCoy, right?
It's
so you almost got
yeah.
mycological education on the side too. That's pretty rad.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there were times where there were like miniature greenhouses full of blocks of mycorrhizae, all sorts of like experiments happening in the kitchen. It was definitely a cool time to be in that community.
And just for your reference, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, he wrote a book called Radical Mycology, so we'll leave a link to that in the show notes. Actually, you first reached out to me, I want to say almost a year ago, and you were asking me about the invasive teasel out here, right? And how maybe we could link the herbal community to your teasel project. We'll get into more of that later, but I'm glad that we're finally able to make this happen.
Yeah.
But why don't we go over some of these talking points and get into the juicy stuff?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not texting right now. Okay. So let's talk about the theme of working in the Upper Willamette Valley and context of nonprofits and land stewardship.
Yeah, great. So Friends of Buford Park in Mount Pisgah is one of a host of conservation nonprofits that are in themselves part of kind of a quilt of organizations, both public and nonprofit, who are responsible for stewarding huge swaths of land. And this is land that is being managed for different purposes here in Howard Buford Recreation Area, which is where a lot of our work is centered. We are really focused on enhancing and stewarding the native habitats and ecosystems that exist here, and balancing that with compatible recreation. And so this park receives over 500,000 visits a year.
Wow.
And so the reason for that is because it's beautiful. I think that as humans, we really know when we're looking at and existing in a habitat and an ecosystem that is healthy, and that has that kind of vibrancy that you really can only have when you are managing for the native species that have been evolving here for millions of years. And this is one of those places. So, we have big swaths of oak savanna and upper Willamette prairie habitat here. And those are some of the most endangered ecosystems that are west of the Mississippi River. There's between 2 and 10% of their original range remaining. And some of the largest contiguous chunks of those are here in the park.
Okay.
And so we work with the public pretty extensively, and really try to bring folks along in the understanding that conserving these places is part and parcel to them being enjoyable for recreation and visiting.
Yeah, so we're actually staying just down the road at one of the RV parks, and I always think, I'm going to go to Mount Pisgah. I need to start thinking about coming to Buford Park more and just walking around, because it is beautiful out here. So if I were to kind of walk around, what do people usually do when they come here? Are they bringing their dogs and just kind of walking around, or the trails?
So this part of the park, we're in the north end of HBRA right now, and this is like one of the hot spots for dog walking, which that's a really good case study for us in thinking about compatible recreation with native wildlife and ecosystems. So folks love to walk their dogs. I have a dog. I love to walk her too. It's really nice when I can take her somewhere beautiful and have her off a leash where she can just exist. But also in this part of the park, we have denning coyotes. And denning coyotes do not get along very well with off-leash dogs. And so that's just one of those kind of rich examples of how bringing folks along in education of what a habitat or an ecosystem requires to be happy and healthy is sometimes limiting on our activity in those places. But it's really for the benefit of such a larger system. Than just where you go to walk your dog. But folks come here to ride horses, they come here to hike. It's one of the main hiking destinations in kind of the Eugene Springfield metro area. So.
You also have that native plant nursery over there, which you have a lot of volunteers, as well as U of O students over there working as well.
Yeah. So Friends works in kind of 3 primary program areas. We do trails maintenance, and so we maintain around 27 miles of trail here in the park. And then we do habitat restoration, which is a lot of what we're talking about today. And then we also maintain a native plant nursery. So in that nursery, we grow around 130 different native species. And those are grown out primarily for restoration purposes. So we grow out some plants to be outplanted, trees, shrubs, herbaceous species. And then really the primary focus of the plant materials program is production of seed.
Okay.
And so we grow plants out through their whole season, from sprouting, flowering, fruiting, those seeds maturing, harvest those plant materials, and then go through a pretty intensive process at times of cleaning the seed out of the chaff. And then once we have that seed, we're able to utilize that in restoration projects. When we have a prescribed fire out here, which is one of our preferred methods for stewardship, and particularly invasive species management. We're able to broadcast native seeds, and in that way really enhance the composition of native species that are in those landscapes.
When was your last burn?
We were able to burn a unit over on the east side of the park, which is adjacent to Pleasant Hill, which is a really small rural community. That's one of the beautiful things about this park. We really bridge one of the largest metro areas in Oregon with small rural communities. So it's a place where those communities really come together. So on the east side, we burned a unit called Meadowlark East. It's has chunks of wet prairie in it, and wet prairie is a subtype of these kind of open grassy ecosystems. And there's actually a species called Bradshaw's lomatium. It's in the carrot family. That it was just recently federally delisted, but is still a state endangered species. And so we were able to burn in that area. We burn in a way that is seasonally informed, so we're not having negative impacts on those native species. And it was an awesome burn to be a part of, because it really burned in this kind of mosaic pattern. So there are areas that were totally untouched, areas that burned more intensively, and then areas where the fire just kind of moved quickly over the surface. And that kind of disturbance is really critical for a lot of these habitats where human roles in the ecology of the place have been a part of them for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I think that's a lot of native wisdom that as Euro-Americans on this landscape we've ignored for hundreds of years. And I feel like there's a way that the conservation community is just starting to get up to speed with where native folks were in 1859. As far as understanding how those stewardship practices are really beneficial for humans and other creatures on the landscape.
It's so good to hear that it's becoming back in fashion to do these controlled burns. And you haven't mentioned the Oregon oak or the Oregon white oak yet, and I'm just curious. It was my understanding that we did controlled burns to help the Oregon white oak, but it sounds like you're doing it almost for lots of different plant species as well. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the plant species that grow in these oak savannas, they've all adapted to fire in one way or another.
Fireweed?
Fireweed for one. Yeah, exactly. There's a reason it's named that. It loves fire. And there are a lot of other species that really love fire. And oak is one that's interesting because a fire can absolutely kill an oak, particularly when there hasn't been fire around that oak for a long time. And so it's the return interval for these fires that is really crucial to them acting in a healthy way on the landscape. Fires have their own behavior, they have their own weather. And so when you really push away that part of the ecology of the place for a long time, it comes back in ways that are really challenging to work with. And we see that in our woodland areas and our forests where we have annual catastrophic wildfire here. And those are in places where if we had more regular fire return intervals, if we were working with fire as a tool and as really an ally on the landscape, we'd be in a much better place.
Do you think, say, in 10 years, as we learn more and do this more, our Northwest forests and the California forests might be more healthier? Do you see this on the horizon?
Certainly. I mean, it's been, I think that prescribed fire in the U.S., it's been a long, hard road to get to where we are now. And it's definitely being accepted as a more viable management strategy and tool. We are really hoping that we're planning that this year will be the year of good fire here in HBRA. And so we have a number of different burns planned I think that it's on the minds of every conservation organization we work with.
Very cool.
And they're really dedicated individuals and communities who are really trying to do the education that's necessary to help people understand what healthy fire looks like, and then really work with the agencies that have a lot of say as far as what can happen to encourage them to accept fire as a management tool.
That's really fascinating. I didn't know we were going to talk about fire, but it's good to hear that there's hope.
Yeah.
So that brings us to let's chat a little bit about cultivating healthy landscape, scale relationships, and touching on non-native and native species and defining invasive.
Sure. Yeah. I think that going back to thinking about how many folks are on this landscape at any time, I think that one of the big pieces of work that we have that's, it's soft work. It's not going out in the field and pulling weeds or maintaining a trail. Yeah. It is working with the community of folks who visit this place and helping them understand what being in healthy and right relationship to these landscapes looked like. And I think that that's something that a lot of folks are thinking about culturally, being in right relationship with one another, being in right relationship with communities we're not a part of, and the plants and animals that live in these natural areas that's another community that we need to consider in the same light. And so we do a lot of outreach. We are a grassroots organization, and so we involve our volunteers at every level of our organization, all the way from making decisions about how we maintain trails and what we do on trails, to what strategies we use for encouraging the native species that live here and managing the species that might be pushing them out of those spaces. And so that's a big cultural project that we're engaged in. And I think it's worth noting too that humans have been a part of the ecology of the ecosystems that we have been indigenous to for as long as we've existed. And so othering humans from the landscapes that we're existing in is, that disconnection, I think, gives a lot of folks a license to be less caring and less responsible.
That makes sense.
On those landscapes.
Yeah. I like the term othering. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, it's just whatever isn't you.
Yeah.
And it's easy to do that with things that don't have eyes.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that's really beautiful about the herbalism community is that the relationship with plants is such a keystone of the work. Yeah. And I think that I can speak for a lot of the folks in the conservation world where that's the same for us. Yeah. I have deep personal relationships with Danthonia californica that grows on the coast where I grew up, and it grows in Olympia, Washington, where I learned so much, and it grows here in the valley. It's just a plant that's existed everywhere that's been important to me. And I think that recognizing the role that we have in opening folks' eyes and awareness up to what that plant is in the first place, that's one of those first steps. And so a lot of that too is thinking about, what is a native plant? What is a non-native plant? What does invasive mean? And what are, and we are working with another term, which is encroaching. And so, native plants are those plants that have been evolving on these landscapes for millions of years. They've been co-evolving. They have relationships with one another. They have relationships with the indigenous people who have been here for time immemorial. And those relationships have been disturbed in big ways by Euro-American colonization and the plants that have come with that institution. And so non-native species represent all of that import that has happened. But often, I think that the idea of non-native is just one and the same with invasive. And I think that there's a lot more depth there that is important to consider. So, invasive species are ones that I really think of as not being in right relationship with their neighbors, right? It's a behavior. And these species, they're not choosing to be malevolent. They don't have a sense of morality. They are just living their best lives in the place that they've been plopped.
Right.
And so, when we start to work with plants like blackberries, like Scots broom, like teasel, it's another relationship. And so thinking about, okay, how can we encourage this plant to behave in ways that make space for all of the native species who were here before it, and make space for this habitat and ecosystem being vibrant and functioning well. So it's not about eradication. It's really about stewarding those plants' existence on the landscape that we're never going to get rid of them. Restoration is not about returning to some mythical pre-state, because that's not possible, right? Time happens, and we are where we are.
That's a sticker. Time happens.
And so I think it's really a matter of recognizing the role that we as humans, and particularly I think we as Euro-American settlers, have in stewarding the relationships with the plants that we decided had a role here to play, or accidentally brought here. But far more of the plants that we see and we have to work with in these ways are ones that were brought here intentionally. Scots broom.
Or unintentionally.
Or, sure. But I think that intentional piece is really important to recognize, because it captures the role that these plants have, and the role that they were intended to have by someone at some point. So like Scots broom was brought to Oregon to beautify and stabilize soils on the sides of our roadsides. It did that job really well.
Talk about a demonized plant too.
Right.
Yeah.
But when you think about the ecology and the natural history of that plant, it loves disturbance. Humans create a lot of disturbance. It fixes nitrogen in those soils, which is beneficial to all sorts of plants, native and non-native. And those yellow flowers are really pretty if you don't necessarily have all of the other context for what that plant is doing on the landscape, right? And so recognizing that, that plant had a role to play, and we brought it here. It played that role for us really well, and now the genie's out of the bottle, and it's doing what it needs and wants to do, and what it has evolved to do, where it came from for millions of years. And so, I think that just all feeds into this like landscape scale idea of relationships and and just acting in healthy ways where we live, and in the places that we enjoy.
I think that was so beautifully put. I think you should honestly consider teaching at an herb conference. I think a lot of people would really dig it. It was very beautifully put. You're not demonizing the plants. You're talking about stewardship versus eradication. Just a really cool way to look at it. There's a book, I want to say, it's called like Evil Plants. have you heard of this? Like,
I haven't.
I think it's basically about different plants throughout history who've been used, like, say, to poison people or whatever. And it's just, I'm not really digging like putting those types of labels on plants, because they're thriving and they, I guess, serve a function and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But you put that really beautifully. Keep rambling.
Great, will do.
native, non-native is very divisive. I like how you did weed in quotations too. What's the quote? A weed is a plant whose virtues are unknown.
Yeah.
Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yeah.
It's I love that quote, and it's like the herbal community. I mean, my spirit plant's dandelion. You know what I mean? Which is like the weed. Are you getting all this?
I am.
Okay. No, it's all good. So Jared, how does scale affect wildcrafting from a restoration perspective?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think scale, when we're thinking in business terms, right, affects everything.
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges that land stewards, and I'm using that term really broadly, so that encompasses everybody from like the Forest Service and the BLM to small nonprofits like ourselves, is recognizing that native plants and plants period have economic value. And yeah, I have to imagine that is an evolution that you've seen in the herbal world.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And there are more like squares and normies talking about using herbal remedies than I ever knew of as a like kid raised by hippies.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, I think that when we introduce those economic factors into those relationships with plants, we have to be really careful. And so, I think that there are ways to have wildcrafting and harvest of native plants and in these habitats that are sensitive and that have all sorts of other pressures that are affecting them, that is responsible, and but it requires cultivating that relationship in a way that isn't like a couple years of book learning about those plants. It's years of watching that plant and harvesting just what you need from that plant and seeing how it responds. There are instances where, you could take an entire individual from a patch of 200 individuals, and more than likely that's not going to have a lasting deleterious effect on that community. But I think that when we're thinking about harvesting plant materials to be used for products that are going to then be used by a lot of people who don't necessarily have those relationships with those plants, that the amount of care that we put into that first step of the process, which is, knowing the landscapes that we're on, finding that plant, and taking that material from that plant, the more care that is put into that process, the better. And I think that there are ways that those of us in the conservation community who, might overlap into the herbal community, but where this land stewardship work is really our home, we have a lot of knowledge and expertise that we would love to share with folks who want to be active in these landscapes. So, I think that we have dealt with locally, observing instances where folks have come through in public lands, the commons, places that are supposed to be for all of us, and taken every single Oregon grape branch that they can find. Right. Or even just like removed far greater than half of the aerial parts of an entire patch. And that's really disturbing for us, I think, in the conservation community. In part because we don't have yet relationships with those folks. If we knew who those folks were and we were in collaboration with them around their interest in the landscape and what's important to them in that landscape, I think that would look a lot different. Yeah. And there are these systems of like permits and and licenses for harvest. And while the process for getting those can be bureaucratic and challenging and boring, it's really an opportunity for collaboration between conservation organizations and folks who have a lot of expertise in what these plants can be used for. And it's a way that we can open up the conversation for sharing expertise across those two communities. I think that there's a lot of work and growth that needs to happen in that. And I think too, in the work that we do in managing invasive species on the landscape, that there are a lot of opportunities to say, hey, do you have interest in this species?
Right.
Because this species is one that we have interest in managing in different ways.
Are you talking about like similar medicinal uses for a more weedy species? In the herbal world, we call those herbal analogs.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plant analogs. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't have enough herbalism knowledge to speak to a lot, but I know that teasel, for one, has medicinal properties.
Yeah.
And teasel also for us, when we think about the amount of land that we have to do our work on. So, for instance, we are an organization of 8 people. That's administrative staff and folks who are on the ground. We steward we steward 2,200 acres just here in the park.
Wow.
So do the math.
Yeah.
It's a lot of acres per person.
Yeah.
And there are only so many hours in the day and so many days in the year.
Right.
And so in order to care for these landscapes with the resources that we have available to us, we have to consider means of doing so that that have been of themselves been demonized in a lot of ways. So we use herbicide. And if you look at a patch of blackberry and Scots broom that is covering 8 acres of land, I would invite anyone to think of another solution that can, in a timely way, create the space for other species to exist there. And that is, the caveat on that, of course, is that if everybody did, management activities on 10 invasive species a day, we'd have it solved.
Right.
It would be fine.
Yeah.
But that's just not the case, and that's not the culture we're currently living in. And so, there are species like teasel where herbicide is not the solution. It doesn't work all that well. Teasel also has leaves that create water cups. It's actually a semi-carnivorous plant.
Did not know that.
So,
Wow.
So insects fall into that water, and then that water helps to increase the nutrients in the soil that teasel lives in.
Are you saying the water the bugs get trapped in have some sort of solution that help digest the bug into the plant to
My
get
understanding
the nutrients?
is that there are some digestive enzymes.
Wow, I did not know
basically,
that.
exist in that water.
Wow.
And regardless,
Yeah.
that structure creates an environment in which nutrients from new places can get into the soil that's there. And teasel being a biennial plant too means that anything that's trapped there is going to fall down in the next year, 2 years, and go to fertilize the new seedlings that might be there. But our method for working on teasel management is clipping the seed cones, really trying to sequester those seeds and reduce the seed bank that exists there. And then also digging the roots, digging out plants, mechanical removal, to keep those plants from going to seed in the following year. And it was great news to us when we learned that the roots are actually what is valuable for folks. And so, I think that while we look at and work with the challenges of native plants having value, economic, cultural, personal value, that we can really invite in, recognizing the values that these invasive species have as well. And we live in capitalism, and where there's a market, there's opportunity. And I think that creating a market for more of these invasive species plant materials is a huge opportunity. And it's an opportunity to benefit the commons and these beautiful places that people enjoy so much. And it's an opportunity to benefit folks who want to make their livelihoods in ways that are centered around relationship with plants. So I would love to see more of that happening. And I know organizations like ours and many others would invite those relationships.
Is this a good point to talk about the Teasel program, or how you want to kind of reach out to the herbal community and how they could participate? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, as one of our many projects, one that we just refer to as our invasive species utilization project. So we have a relationship with Wildcraft Cider Works, where there are a number of heirloom apple trees that are here, particularly in this area of the park, and heirloom walnut trees. We also have English hawthorn. All of those plants have plant materials that are useful in cider making. So there's a liqueur that's made from the walnuts. There's a Pisgah heirloom cider that is made from apples from the site.
I've had that before. Yeah.
It's great. And then the hawthorn palms, the berries that come off of hawthorn trees, are used in other ciders of theirs.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's just amazing to get to see those species, which birds love all those things. The cows that used to roam all over this landscape when this was
the wild cows,
pretty wild. When this was a homestead and dairy farm, they spread those seeds far and wide, along with like sweet cherry that has started to grow wild because of that distribution. It's great to be able to sequester those seeds, make delicious cider out of them, and then keep them from propagating on the landscape. And then for teasel, really it's been an experimental process. Again, because we as a conservation organization don't have the expertise in herbal plant materials. So, we started to establish relationships with like wildcrafting wholesalers, and really like feeling out those relationships for how ethical they were necessarily, because recognizing that there is harvest of native plant materials that in our eyes as a conservation organization just isn't happening in ethical ways. We didn't necessarily want to work with folks who were inviting that activity and incentivizing it. Right. And so that's been a hurdle. And then also really trying to, like we do in all of our programs, expand the community that we're engaging for that activity. And so last year we had a pretty successful experience in working with Looking Glass School, which is
very cool.
It's an alternative school here in Eugene. A lot of the kids who are engaged there are classrooms are challenging. And when you can invite them into a classroom that looks like this, things look a lot different. And so, and additionally, saying, hey, digging up these roots is really beneficial for the work that we do, and making this classroom a happier, healthier place, and it's also a source of income. So that's been a partnership that we've developed, and we're continuing to develop and work with. But there's a missing piece there, and I think that those relationships that are just based in transactions are ones that don't have depth, and they don't have they aren't informed really by the work that we do here. And so our hope, and I would love if this is a catalyst for that, is to engage more individuals in the herbalism community to work with organizations like ours, to harvest for themselves plant materials that are useful to them. And that's a process that we can facilitate through our conservation partners. This park is owned by Lane County, and we are guest stewards here. And there's another nonprofit that operates in the park, and so we have to operate within a pretty complex web of relationships. And so we can facilitate those relationships with herbalists to come out here. Be informed about the priorities we have and the work that we are doing after 32 years of stewarding these landscapes, and the knowledge that we have gained from that really long-standing relationship with these plants and places. And yeah, just I want to have work parties of herbalists out here where we're just going after a patch of teasel and being able to come back the next year and see that, there are fewer individuals, and recognizing that that's a good thing. But then maybe the next year looking at like harvesting blackberry leaves or whatever might be of use and valuable, and a way that we can integrate that work in a much broader community context. I think there's a lot of space for, restorative, certified herbal products, where there's, there's an understanding for consumers that those products came to them via a relationship with place and a process that is really beneficial for all of the organisms involved.
Have you heard that there's medicinal value in the blackberry root?
No.
Yeah, so it's a very highly astringent. I believe it's kind of known as like good for if you have like diarrhea.
Sure.
But you could put a sign at the end of the driveway that says "You pick blackberry root." That's a Stephen Yeager joke. So, but yeah, I love the idea of work parties and getting more herbalists involved. I know we still have a couple more points to go over, so not to sound like I'm wrapping it up, but if people are interested and want to contact you, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so our website is a great resource. It's bufordpark.org. My direct email is volunteer@bufordpark.org. And I am kind of the one who's coordinating a lot of those efforts. And I think that those would probably be the best two places.
Very good. So you mentioned this term encroaching earlier, and I was fascinated by that. I'd never heard that before. So why don't you tell us more about encroaching, specifically maybe around the Doug firs and the Oregon white oak?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a term to really distinguish the behaviors of non-native species versus native species, and it can be in similar habitats. So in the oak savanna and prairie ecosystems that we work in primarily, they have been dependent on disturbance, usually in the form of fire, for millennia. Doug fir, really in geologic historical terms, is a newcomer to lowland areas, and so it doesn't like fire. So we actually have areas of oak savanna that have started to be encroached upon by Douglas fir, because white people also haven't historically liked fire.
Right.
And so with that fire exclusion that has happened, those Douglas fir, their behavior doesn't leave space for those other organisms. And so, you know, and it's kind of amazing the way that that can be reflected in the shape of a tree. So if you think about like the stereotypical profile of a oak tree, it has this like kind of beautiful mushroom shape to it, right?
Yeah.
The only way that it gets to that shape is because of having ample access to sunlight on all aspects.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
When Douglas fir starts to encroach, and again, Douglas fir is just living its best life.
Yeah.
You know,
It's not evil.
It wants that sun too.
Yeah.
But when it starts to really encroach in an area, those oak trees, their shape changes. So they become these like skinny vase-like.
Wow, I'm gonna have to
trees.
pay attention to that. I've never noticed that or thought about it.
Yeah, and so over the past couple of decades, more than that, I'm sure, there have been a lot of projects called oak release. We're really trying to release oaks from the binds of the coniferous species, cedars, firs, that are really hemming them in. And so you can look at patches of oaks and you can tell, did you grow up with all the light you needed, or did you grow up really searching for that light the whole time? Douglas fir also grows a lot faster than oaks do. And so it has that competitive edge. And it's really only through the relationship with humans and lightning,
Right.
a major source of ignition for wildfire, that those oaks are able to live their best lives, and Douglas fir is encouraged into being in better relationship with all of those other species.
Maybe this is the capitalist coming out, but I'm curious, is there a difference between, say, cutting down a Doug fir and using it for its timber as opposed to doing like a controlled burn?
Sure.
I suppose the fire, again, going back to our earlier part of the conversation, is beneficial to a lot of other species.
Right.
So there's the advantage there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this ties into, a lot of our messaging and intent around talking to the herbalist community about invasive species, is that economic piece is really important. So when we think about doing those kinds of conifer management activities, if revenue can come from that, if there is some economic benefit that can be reaped, then that means that we have more resources to do more work across more area.
Sure.
And do our work in better ways,
Yeah.
both for ourselves as the folks, where our livelihoods are based on the health of these ecosystems and our ability to do this stewardship work. And we're able to really spread those resources in different ways.
Yeah.
So the kinds of fires that we look to have on the landscape here are low intensity and low severity. And so that intensity piece refers to, during a fire, how much heat is produced, how tall those flames are, how fast the fire moves across the landscape. And those all have effects on the severity. And the severity refers to what the impacts of that fire or those fires, as there are fires more often, what those long-term impacts are.
Okay.
And so the kinds of fires that kill conifers, and the kinds of fires that kill oaks, for that matter, are ones that are of higher severity. And that's usually because of a lot of fuel loading, right? Where you have a lot of woody material, a lot of thatch from grasses. Blackberry is a wonderful example because blackberry burns like heck. Blackberry produces a lot of material as it grows. And so we have to be really careful when we are planning prescribed burns and ecological burning in general. One, because those are the requirements that we're under. The restrictions around how you can implement prescribed fire are strict and extensive.
Okay.
They're really, comprehensive of all of the potential risk involved. And we have to look at it also from that ecological lens of how do we protect the oaks where we're burning, and how do we, control that fire in ways that are contributing to our objectives there.
Okay.
So, removing thatch, pushing back Douglas fir trees. So we don't ever want a situation, or at least in very specific situations, we would be open to like a Douglas fir tree torching, but generally not, because that's not the kind of fire that really is beneficial for the habitats that we work in. A Douglas fir tree torching and then falling down or whatever, like that's a huge amount of heat. The impacts from that are going to be ones that really take a much longer time to recover from for native species and other parts of the ecology that we want to encourage there.
So typically on the show we ask, what's your favorite part about being an herbalist, but you don't identify as an herbalist. So we're going to say, Jared, what's your favorite part about the work that you do?
Sure. Yeah. That's a hard question.
Yeah. Put you on the spot.
I think that at least this week, my favorite part about the work that I do is all of the relationships that I get to cultivate. I get to cultivate relationships with my coworkers, folks who are, equally passionate and dedicated to serving all of the organisms that live on this landscape in the best way possible. I get to cultivate relationships with volunteers who are really pushing aside a lot of the structures of capitalism and profit. They're coming out here and giving their time for that same mission, and then cultivating deeper relationships with the land and with the plants and with the animals that all depend on this place that I get to spend my time caring for.
I love that. And besides herbal medicine, if you want other types of medicine for your mental and spiritual health, volunteering is honestly one of the best things you could do. When I was a kid, I would volunteer at the library. I loved volunteering there. The soup kitchen at Food for Lane County was another good one. But if you're in the Eugene area, definitely consider volunteering at Friends of Buford Park. They're doing awesome work. Just want to say thanks for taking the time, Jared. That was super informative, and I love hearing a perspective from a non-herbalist, but you really know your stuff. So
appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, really, to talk to folks. I think that finding the connectors for these communities can be really challenging sometimes. So this is just a wonderful opportunity for that, and just great talking to you.
Likewise. So BufordPark.org and volunteer at BufordPark.org. So, all right, we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.